Greetings, everybody. We have the returning Dan Coxon today because we have a re-release of a
We do.
particular collection that I was very excited about. So, hello, Dan. Welcome back.
Hello. It's funny, it's a re-release, but it's almost a new
It's
release.
yeah.
The publisher are essentially treating it as a new release because it reached so few people the first time round.
It was such a shame, but I think it's even better this time around for reasons that we'll get onto in a second. So this was the first edition.
It
Come
was
Sing for the
indeed.
Harrowing. And those who are familiar with my channel or website might remember me talking about this a lot because it was in my top two collections of 2024, and three of the stories in it made my top 20 short stories of that year as well. But now we have this lovely new.
And you are very lucky to have one because I don't actually have one at the moment. I've given them all away.
It looks absolutely fabulous for a start. The cover
Yeah, they've
alone.
they've they've done a wonderful job on the cover. It
Yeah.
was one of those funny things with publishers where they kind of asked me my thoughts on what I would like, and I had absolutely no idea. So we just kind of agreed that we didn't want it to be the same as the original release, so we wanted something a bit different. And I kind of went, well, what about woodcuts? I kind of quite like kind of woodcut style
Yeah.
covers, and it's folk horror, so that kind of fits. And then their
Yeah.
artist just came back with that, which is amazing, frankly.
Yes. Matthew
That's right.
I,
Yeah, I don't know his surname, but yeah, it's
uh,
Matthew. Yeah.
sorry if I
Um,
mispronounced your surname, Matthew, if you're watching this, but Matthew did this. Yeah, it was a shame because I remember getting a copy of the first edition, raving to it about it to everyone that would listen to me, and then people were like, "Hey, where do you get it from?" And I was like, "Oh my God, it had
I
a
was
very
literally,
short
literally
window."
reached the point where I was being messaged by people on Instagram and things, kind of saying, "Oh, I've seen reviews of your book, but I can't find it for sale anywhere. Where can I get one?" And at that point, I was like, "You can't, you can't get one, unfortunately. I have a few, but that's about it in the world."
It's like the Gemma Moore's novella, The Folly, came
Yeah.
out. There was a big buzz about it, and then unfortunately the press kind of closed. So
This is essentially what happened with me as well. I mean, it does happen, and especially if you're dealing with kind of smaller independent presses. It's just
yeah.
like, they do close with some regularity, and if you just happen to be one of the last couple of things that came out, you're kind of stuck.
Well,
Um,
on the plus side, there should be quite a lot of anticipation for this now. Um, and I did notice that you snuck a couple of extra stories into this as well that
Yeah,
we'll
we
get
discussed
into.
that right at the beginning, and it was actually something I wanted to do, probably more for me than for anyone else. Just so that in my head, it was a separate and new thing, and not
Mhm.
just a reissue of the one that had come before. So I was like, you know what, I'm still writing things in this kind of vein and
Mm.
still working on stories. So if they're ready in time, would you like them? And Christoph at Clash went, oh yes, please. Well, let's make it a bit bigger. And I was like, excellent. So yeah,
Yeah.
we basically did that. We stuck an extra couple of stories in, one of which has been published in Blood in the Bricks, which Neil Williamson edited um, for New Compress, and then the other of which, Needles and Pins, has not been published anywhere. So
Mhm.
that is now original to the collection, the new version of the collection.
Yeah. Oh, both excellent stories, by the way. I enjoyed because I reread it in anticipation for my new review that I will be posting about it. But that was fun because the yeah our sister of Blackthorn, I got to, I was like, I'm sure that wasn't in the. So I compared table of contents. I was like, oh, cool. There's a couple of new ones. Um, so for people who didn't get it the first time round that might be interested um now. It's coming out in April, right?
Yes, 21st, which is
25th
two
of
days after
April.
my birthday, which is lovely.
Oh, lovely. Would you like to tell people a little bit about the collection?
Yeah, so I mean, it basically it grew kind of organically from something I was trying to do, which was exploring kind of different ways of telling folk horror stories.
Hmm.
Folk horror has always been a genre that I've really enjoyed, but it's also a genre that I've always felt is in like really severe danger of just becoming trapped in its own tropes. It seems to have much
Hmm.
more kind of solidified tropes than a lot of other genres do or subgenres do.
Yeah.
Um, and I was like, well, how can we break out of that? What else can we do with it? And I love weird fiction and the uncanny, as you know. So I was kind of like, well, what if I try and tell more folk horror stories in a really kind of weird fiction way and go in that direction instead, and try putting other things into the mix and telling folk horror stories in different ways. And then there's a few in there which, quite rightly, a few reviewers kind of said, "I'm not sure it's a folk horror story." Some of them probably aren't. Some of them are a bit tenuous. But the general thrust of the collection overall is very much trying to reimagine what the kind of what folk horror could look like going forward if it took different shapes and forms, basically.
Mhm. Well, I suppose a few of the more outlier kind of stories are a bit more experimental with folk horror, but I think you can reasonably still,
I think there is
you know,
a folk horror connection. I think some are like really clearly and very firmly folk horror, and you
mhm.
would certainly read them and think that was a folk horror story I just read. Whereas, yeah, some you might not, but I would probably make a case for them still just about sneaking in uh, one way or
Yeah.
another.
Well, something that I would like potential readers of this to know is that so I read it originally in 2024, so end of 2024. I think it was must have been December because it I remember it being one of the last collections that I read and I was like, "Oh, just in time for my best of list actually." Um and so when I sat down with this new version, I thought, oh, I'm gonna have to refresh my memory about all of the stories I've already read because I have read on average between 500 and 600 stories a year, so like 1,000 more stories, pretty much in this like same
Yes.
couple of years, and generally, I find a lot of the short stories I read hard to remember later just because of there's just not enough room in my brain, I guess. With each new collection I read, it shoves them up. However, when I sat down to reread this, I found myself remembering like instantly. As soon as I started reading the story, I was like, "Oh yeah, this was the one with," and there were a few that were just I just was cemented in there anyway. But they came back to me so fast, and then I just had an absolute um like great time rereading because then I got to look for other things in the reread, like little clues and stuff because I knew where the stories were going. Um, so yeah, that's something I do want readers to know is that despite forgetting almost everything I read because of the amount I read, this is still it's got to be in my top five collections currently, just generally speaking. And I loved the new stories, Dan, especially Our Sister of Blackthorn. Um, I was thinking about how I would describe that, and what I loved in the folk horror for that one was that it's like an urban contemporary um backdrop to it because it's set on an estate and the reasons for why things are happening, I was like, oh, that's so current. I don't want to spoil it, but it's just it was.
With Yeah, that was written with Neil's anthology Blood and the Bricks in mind, and the
Mhm,
remit for that was specifically for kind of urban
mhm,
folk horror, which I just thought was really interesting. Because again, I mean, I've been playing around with folk horror and trying to do different stuff anyway. So the fact that he was asking for something like that, I was kind of like, okay, that's really interesting because I kind of feel it's always been about class to some extent,
mhm.
um, and quite often about. I mean, quite often you have your kind of your Lord of the Manor type figures who are kind of very upper class, and I kind of feel like I don't know that kind of traditional folk horror trope didn't seem to kind of fit the kind of contemporary
Mhm.
kind of setting quite so well. I kind of felt like there's a different thing going on with class now than we had going on, I don't know, 80 years ago, say.
Yeah.
Um, so it was just to me, it was just interesting to play with that and to set it on a modern day estate with all of the class assumptions that come with
Mhm.
that, I guess. The other thing was, well, I was listening to a lot of podcasts around that time, so it was fun. I played around as well with the idea of it being a podcaster and
Mhm.
doing a kind of. Um, it was a little bit of a cut up technique, so I wrote all of the podcast bits of it first as a continuous podcast, and
Mhm.
then chopped up and used bits of it to intersperse between the rest of the story. So that was me just kind of playing around with form a bit, to be honest.
Do you know, this is the weirdest thing because this film is not folk horror, but I feel like if they'd wanted to, they could have suddenly made it folk horror. Eden Lake. Have you
Oh
seen
yeah,
that?
yeah, yeah.
So, it was just the end of Eden Lake where there's very much a we look after our own. uh
Yes.
kind of thing, and you just realize how much trouble the main character's in after everything she's already been through. And I thought, like, if the filmmaker had really wanted to throw a curveball in, they could have made that like, do you know what I mean? Like, they could
Well,
have done
and
anything.
I think a lot of things play with that kind of folk horror trope, don't they? That kind
Yeah,
of like, not being one of us, being the outsider, which is at the core of most folk horror in one way or another. Um,
yeah. But
so
they,
it's kind of interesting that I think people play with that outside of the folk horror genre quite a lot, even outside of the horror genre, to be honest.
yeah, yeah. Well, I had the same feeling at the end of that story as I did at the end of Eden Lake, which is why I thought of it. I was like, oh my God, like, because you always know in folk horror that if you're the outsider, it's probably going to be a bad time for you. Um, so considering, so you wrote a lot of these stories, obviously, a few years back now. Has the things that you let me rephrase that. That was terrible wording. Have the things that drew you to folk horror in the first place changed from then to now?
Um, To some extent, I think in that at the time I was struggling to find folk horror that I thought felt contemporary and interesting. I
Hmm.
think now there has been a bit more, to be honest. I
Hmm.
think a few people probably had the same kind of thought that folk horror was still alive and kicking, and what can we do with it that's a bit more interesting than what we were
Hmm.
doing with it 10 years ago. Um, I think as well, I mean, the whole kind of conception of that original collection was kind of weird in that some of them were quite old stories. So, I mean, if you check down like the copyright dates on them, some of them are sort of 5 or 6 years old. But then I'd written basically half a collection, and uh, Willow, who at the time was the publisher, she kind of said to me, "Have you got enough for a full collection?" So I then basically concentrated for 6 months on just writing stories for that collection.
Hmm.
So you have some older stories. You have a bunch of kind of like stories that are written quite intensively over
Hmm.
a fairly short period on the specifically on the theme, and then you now have two new ones just to even confuse the water even further. So the kind of the whole way it came into being was kind of it was kind of both slow and fast at the same time, if that made sense. It was kind of
Hmm.
like it was an interest over a number of years, but actually, the actual writing of about 50% of it was done during a 6 month period.
Hmm.
And it wasn't that long ago. It wasn't, it would have been probably about 6 months before you read it.
Yeah.
So it still feels fairly fresh to me, to be honest. I still, those stories in particular, the ones that were the newer ones that I'd written just for the collection.
Hmm.
Um, they still feel quite recent for me, partly because I don't write a huge number of short stories anyway. I write like 3 or 4 a year if I'm lucky. So,
Hmm. I was thinking about the what you were just saying about class and how that plays into because a lot of folk horror for anyone who just hasn't read much folk horror or they kind of don't know what we're talking about, they tend to be stories about weird small towns that have strange practices, and then an outsider will come in and be surprised by the practices, and a lot of the time there's a human sacrifice involved. Not always. But yeah, you have really played with the form and conventions a lot. And in terms of the class thing that I find really interesting, I'm gonna ask you if this was a conscious choice or if this was just an
ah,
instinctual thing as you were writing. A lot of the time in folk horror of years past, these communities tend to be depicted or it's sort of alluded to that they're small, possibly impoverished communities, people that like the wider world might just look down on in general, like they would just seem strange and odd to them anyway. So there is a bit of a stereotype, I think, with the people who are responsible for the horror, because they're worshipping something, and a lot of people that would consider themselves more intelligent be like, well, there isn't even evidence of a god. Like, do you know what I mean? That kind of stuff. But your stories kind of explore these people in a bit more creatively, I find. So there are people that are like, oh, we're doing the thing, but we're really sorry about it. We haven't really got a choice, or, wrong place, wrong time, or people that are willing. Um, to do
yeah,
what needs to be done for the story, you know. So
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was definitely one of the things I was looking to play with. I mean, like you say, I mean, it's by no means true of all folk horror. Whenever you make
Mhm.
generalizations, there are always going to be outliers, and you'll always
Yeah.
have people saying, "Oh, but what about this?" But for a lot of folk horror, yeah, you have like usually kind of quite impoverished, quite uneducated, definitely kind of working class, if not kind of even below that, and kind of
Mhm.
slave class at times. Um, and yeah, they have kind of like these weird old rituals. And then you quite often have the character who is kind of the eyes and ears of the viewer or the reader who comes into that environment, and
Mhm.
they're intended to be much more intelligent and educated and probably slightly better off.
Mhm.
And then they fall prey to these,
Mhm.
slightly backward country folk. And it
Yeah.
just, again, it feels so classist and so antiquated. It feels really, really old-fashioned, even just to
Mhm.
say it out loud. So that's a lot of what I was doing. I mean, I think I did it in different ways, and I think sometimes I did it more consciously than others.
Mhm.
I think Our Sister of Blackthorn, it was definitely consciously.
Yeah.
I got about halfway through writing it, and then I realized that I had to at least tell some of it from the point of view of somebody on the estate, because
Mhm.
that's the voice I wanted to hear. I wanted to hear the voice of
Yeah.
the impoverished people at the bottom of the socio-economic ladder, not
Mhm.
necessarily the more educated person who's coming in from the outside. Um, and it was kind of interesting then is like what happens then if you're asking the reader to identify with the masses
Mhm.
who are working class rather than the outsider who's come in
Yeah.
to that environment. And it's like, how does that change the narrative if people are identifying with them instead of identifying with the outsider? So,
Well, yeah.
yeah, just
It,
playing with that kind of stuff. I did it with some of the other ones as well. Like I said, some were more conscious than others. Um, some I was just mucking around and having fun, to be honest, with some of them as well. Um,
yeah.
and it was just, I mean, you know me, it's always about what's interesting. I kind of it's not that I want to second guess the reader, but I quite often ask myself, well, have I seen this kind of story before? And if so, do I want to go there again, or do I want to try and do something different with it? So I'm constantly looking to see, well, what else can you do that's not the way that people are going to expect it to go?
Well, I found it. I always find it much more interesting when the villain of a story is someone that, if it were written entirely from their perspective, you could see them as heroic, or you could at least understand where they're coming from. And that story, it really reminded me of just the town I live in, where
Yeah,
everyone is let down by the people who is, who we vote into power, and they're supposed to be looking after us. And it'll be from tiny things to there is a pothole on my street that they keep fixing, but they're not doing a proper fix on it because a couple of months later it's a crater again. And it's tiny things like that where people's cars are getting messed up because the council just won't spend the extra money to fix a pothole properly to, there's there's no housing and healthcare and
yeah,
libraries or and I could I can see I'm always thinking about the reasons for crime. I can completely see why people are making money in illegal ways because it's so difficult depending on where you live to even get a job, so support yourself and your family. So
well, that was kind of one of the core ideas in that as well, is just the kind of the idea that yes, these people are doing something slightly unsavory, which we obviously won't say too much about because it's kind of the end of the story. But it's like, yeah, as you say, they are the folk horror mob, aren't they?
yeah,
But equally, they're doing it for a reason. It's not just because they're kind of warped and weird, and
yeah, yeah.
they're doing it because their lives are hard and pretty rubbish, and this gets them through somehow, one way or another.
Yeah, it's
Um,
it's less for glory and riches and more for survival.
yeah.
Um,
And it's
yeah.
like I think on the one hand it feels very contemporary because these are all very contemporary concerns. On
Mhm.
the other hand, I kind of feel like they've been contemporary concerns for most of my lifetime. It's not
Yeah.
like it's kind of like a flash in the pan that's going to suddenly not be relevant in a year's time. Um, these are things that people struggle with genuinely, and I think that we struggle with as a country that has had a class structure in the past.
Mhm.
Um, which now is still, we've got kind of the remnants of it still sitting there in the background.
Mhm.
Um, It's interesting, and I find it interesting as well. I lived in America for 6 years, and I find what's going on there at the moment is just mind-boggling in so many ways. But not least because I mean they are very much turning into a society with a class structure.
Yeah.
Um, they've always kind of like sold themselves as a classless society, and anyone can make it in America. This has not been the case for a while,
Yeah, the American
and it's
dream
very
and all
clear.
that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And it's very much turning into a class structure, but it's a class structure that's based on money and how much money you have. But
mhm,
that essentially is where our class structure came from originally,
mhm.
was those who had money lorded it over those who didn't, and then their children inherited it, and on and on and on, and
Yeah.
then folk horror.
Well, I was after reading Come Sing for the Harrowing, I was thinking about how I don't know if I've read any really folk horror stories where the group or the folk horror folk are, rich people. And I'm wondering if that's because rich people are increasingly alien to the rest of us, and it wouldn't even be surprising to read a folk horror story where rich people are, sacrificing people or whatever, because it already feels
I
like
mean, interestingly, at least in my experience, and again, I'm sure there are exceptions, but at least in my experience, the place where they tend to appear is that kind of Lord of the Manor figure. So they will be
yeah,
like the one lording it over all the impoverished masses,
yeah,
and quite often controlling them or forcing them to do their kind of like deviant work.
yeah.
Um, but yeah, they're never the masses. You don't get the masses of of rich, well-off people.
I'm sure that there are some ethical multimillionaires. Uh, but yeah, I think it's just not much of a stretch for us to imagine that those kinds of people would just gladly feed the rest of us into a grinder in the first place. So it's
Yeah,
like,
yeah. And it feels, I mean, class feels like a major issue at the moment. I mean, it was very noticeable over Christmas and over like the Christmas book sales period.
mm,
The one really successful anthology was Bog People, which was the explicitly working class folk horror anthology. And it's exactly why. It's because it feels like a really pertinent issue again.
yeah,
Um, and I think it is because of that widening divide. It's like the rich are getting richer and richer, and the gap is getting bigger and bigger between those at the top and those who are just getting by. Not even necessarily those at the bottom, those even in the middle. There's quite
yeah,
a big gap between those at the top and those in the middle. Um, so I think it does feel very contemporary, and I think it's one of the reasons why folk horror is kind of interest again. I'm seeing more and more folk horror again at the moment, in both films and books, and I think that's why.
yeah. I think, yeah, I agree with you, and I just, I just think that the actual wealth hoarding evil people are really lucky that we don't all have like a deity that we can feed them to. Because the feeling I get, because yeah, I think that folk horror's having a little bit of a resurgence again, because I've been a lot of people are sending me folk horror at the moment to
Yeah.
review, and something that I'm noticing a little bit more is that my feeling isn't like doesn't always tend to be like, oh no, oh get out of there. It's a bit more like, oh yeah, they need to get their sacrifice though, because like I'm kind of a bit more like ambiguous about even where I'm sitting with it anymore, because I'm like,
Well, I think that ambiguity is really interesting, and I think, in all honesty, I think for me personally, that's the way forward for the folk horror genre.
yeah,
Is playing with that ambiguity, at least for the time being,
yeah,
because that's what we're seeing in the real world, and it's fiction in general is most interesting when it reflects things that we're concerned about in the real world. Um,
yeah. I'm wondering if people, a few years from now will be looking back at the horror of today and commenting on that, about how clearly reflective it is of the financial struggles of the nation and stuff, and the opinion of the elite. I hate that term, but when this we've got members of the royal family getting arrested for things, terrible things, and they're just making 100 million a year off the taxpayer. People are getting a little fed up. Um, Adam Neville's new book has a sort of a tech billionaire character in it, which is unusual for Neville, because again, small town and everything. But yeah, I'm seeing it more and more appearing now. So I think it'll be interesting a few years from when we're talking about it.
I think it, I mean I think it's very much hot topic. I mean, yeah, we shall have to see how things
Yeah.
unravel from here, whether it's still hot in 5 years. But maybe it'll be too close to home after we've burned them all at the stake.
Yes. Well, I think maybe the cathartic thing about, especially your collection with the way that you've used the themes and the sort of the character archetypes and things that you typically see is um the horror of the real world, financially, just for example, it's very stressful and anxiety inducing and everything, and people are feeling quite powerless. But in these stories, there's a reason for the evil. It's so even though uh a lot of the time the protagonist doesn't come out on top, there are still rules. There's like a reason that this is
Yes.
happening, and there are rules, and maybe that means that this chain could be broken at some point. And I think it feels a little kind of comforting in a weird way to read this stuff because at least there are parameters,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
know?
and in all honesty, I mean, I've said before as well. I think that's one of the appeals of horror for a lot of people.
Mhm.
Is it's why you get a lot of people weirdly who have anxiety issues and
Yeah.
are quite nervous or fearful people. Quite often, quite like reading horror, and I think it's because it enables you to face that fear or that anxiety, but within a controlled framework.
Mhm.
You know it's not real. You know there are
Yeah.
rules governing it, and you can face it, and then you can walk away at the end of it thinking, oh
Yeah.
yeah, I faced it. Maybe it wasn't so bad or whatever. But
Yeah.
you can face it in that controlled environment without it being real life and being out of control. Again, I think it's one of the reasons why we're seeing horror still on the rise at the moment, is because people have so much stuff to be worried about at the moment in the real world that this is
Yeah.
a way of facing fear and experiencing fear in a controlled environment, so
Mhm.
that you're then, you can feel a little bit more confident about the real world. Um,
Yeah, because you're exploring like especially because we're dealing so strongly with metaphors just about what we're um going through just generally speaking, but because it's like boxed in with rules, it feels a bit safer. There's like a narrative that makes sense in these horror stories as opposed to the real world just feels a bit like what's happening?
It was funny actually, quite bizarrely. So someone else, when I was doing a podcast, asked me about the role of religion in my stories, and my first
Mhm,
reaction was kind of like, "Oh, I don't write. I mean, I'm not religious. I don't really write about religion. It's not something that
mhm.
interests me." And then I looked at it, and I was like, "Oh my God!" I suddenly realized that actually there are like moments in lots of these stories where somebody kind of has this kind of like religious epiphany,
Yeah.
or somehow goes up to another level. And then I was thinking about like one of my favorite horror films of all time is what's it called, A Dark Song. And that
Oh,
also does that. It's very gritty and realistic and quite dirty and grimy, and then
mm,
suddenly goes into this like weird euphoric epiphany at the end. And
yeah.
it's like there's something about me that's really attracted to that. And I don't know what it is.
That film is so underrated and underseen, I think.
It's amazing. It's an amazing film. Absolutely
It's
amazing film.
yeah, it was I found it really scary for a bit there. But
It is, and in all honesty, it's the people that are scary more
yeah,
than the supernatural elements in it, weirdly. And I
yeah,
kind of feel it for me as well. It touches lots of the things I love. It touches that kind of kitchen sink kind of grubby griminess, but at the
yeah.
same time doing kind of interesting horror things. But the horror itself is kind of weird and slightly
Hmm.
insubstantial. You can't quite put your finger on even exactly what's happened.
Yeah.
It's just this kind of like weird out of world experience.
Well,
Um,
I read that they did like an enormous amount of research on the ritual that's used in that film,
yeah,
which
yeah,
I'm not religious either, and I don't believe in anything supernatural. So I was surprised by how fearful I became of the ritual, but I think it's because of like the characters believing so strongly that
yeah.
they were gonna like, and I just think, God, what kind of headspace do you have to be in to really believe that such the because it's really extreme, some
And
of
it's
it.
almost it kind of feels like religious ritual as self-harm. It's really
Yeah.
um
Yeah.
And it's on a psychological level, it's really kind of quite interesting and intense as well. But then it turns out to not just be self-harm, and actually it is an actual ritual.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, God, yeah, it was really interesting the way like it's not for the if you're of the crowd that does not enjoy a slow burn, this is not for you. I would say this film, but if you're somebody who's interested in like a cult and you want to see a different approach to it, like because I haven't seen anything like this before, I think this is very unique. Um,
And
much
also, I
like
mean, I'm not a big viewer of horror films, and
mm,
I've said this before and had to apologize for it on multiple occasions. Most horror films I don't like. I find them quite silly, especially
mhm,
whenever there's any kind of monster. As soon as you get to the monster reveal, I mean, so many films I've watched, and I like first half or so, I'll be watching it, and go, this is really good. I'm quite enjoying. This is really interesting, and then the
yeah.
monster reveal comes halfway through, and I'm like, yeah, okay, I'm kind of tuning out now. This has just got like pantomime.
I'm getting very grumpy. I like old sci-fi horror, Alien, The Thing, that kind of stuff. I
Yeah.
really enjoy. But I get it. I guess I'm getting grumpy because whenever something new comes out and everyone's raving about it, I'm like, oh, go on, I'll give it a go. And then I'm like, oh, I hate it. I can't buy any of this. I'm really having a hard time buying what they're selling to
But I
me.
think I kind of feel like A Dark Song is, in many ways, it's not a horror film. I
Yeah,
mean, it kind of is, and it's horrific, but it's not a horror film, at least not in the way that a lot of the horror genre will recognize a horror film. And so I think if
yeah.
you were heavily into horror movies and you went to see it, you'd be like, what was that?
It's not for the Saturday night horror film at the cinema kind of crowd, I
Yeah.
don't think, because it's a bit it's more a exploration of a damaged psyche kind of
Yeah, and it's
film.
genuinely intense and quite disturbing.
It is,
Which
yeah.
again, I find a lot of actual horror movies are much more like pantomime. They're not actually that horrific or disturbing. They're just kind
Yeah.
of a bit silly. They're more like Scooby-Doo.
Yeah. Um no, it's funny that you say you didn't think that you were doing much with religion in your stories because that's almost a connective tissue
It really is,
for
yeah.
a
I mean,
lot of
again,
them.
it's a big part of folk horror. So I think that's
Yeah.
partly where it's come from, is from folk horror. Because, like I said, I'm not religious. My family's not religious. I've never been brought up in any kind of religious
Mhm.
environment. So it's not really a part of my makeup at all, I don't think. Um, but uh, there is a slight fascination about it's not so much about the religion itself as it is about that kind of moment of kind of euphoria and ecstasy,
Mhm.
that kind of like breaking beyond the confines of the world, which is also what really good kind of weird fiction and uncanny fiction does. That kind of breaking away the veil of the world and seeing something different and magnificent beyond the veil that
Mm.
you didn't even know was there the whole time. That is a religious experience. So I think it's those two things being pressed together at times. It's kind of like that element of religion, that kind of idea of there being something beyond the veil and everything is somehow being managed by a greater power that none of us understand,
Mhm.
which very much becomes cosmic horror, doesn't it? That's
Yeah, and also there's a cult element to it
yeah,
as well. And I'm not saying that religious people are all in a cult or anything, but just for the purposes of but I do think that there are culty groups within some religions, like they're the kind of like the real extremist kind of people. So, um, in general, I wouldn't view Christianity as a cult. However, a friend did take me to their church once, and that church felt culty to me because it was like I'd been in churches at various points in my life. Nothing ever felt like this one. This was very like they were very focused on bringing new members in. Like it was their main like they every member of the church had been tasked with bringing three new people in a year and
yeah.
I was like that feels a bit like they just had to write down the names of the people and like report back about how they were trying to.
It doesn't help with all the kind of stuff that we read and we watch, does it?
No, and
You look
it
at
was
that and you're just like, hmm.
the feeling, it was very intense. Like I went because this person was like, "Oh, I just really want you to meet my friends." I was like, "Okay, but I don't believe like I feel a bit weird going to church because I don't believe in this, so I don't want to like come across as disrespectful or something." And they were like, "No, no, no, we just want you to meet my friends and everyone's already going to be there. It's like a little event." And I was like, "Okay." And the second I walked in, it was I felt a bit it people are very intensely excited. Oh, a young person in the church. Oh, so happy to have a new member. And I was like, new member? No, I was just told there'd be snacks and so yeah, I think that that's what draws me to folk horror is that feeling of like the fear of indoctrination, I suppose. And because a lot of folk horror, a lot of the time it is supernatural and it does turn out to be some sort of god, but a lot of the time it doesn't necessarily have to be that way because I think what's more frightening is the behavior of the people because of what they
Yes.
believe rather than
Yes.
whether or not it's actually happening.
I'm working on something at the moment, which is very early stages, but it's very cult orientated. So I'm doing quite a lot
Mhm.
of reading around cults.
Yeah.
I'm bizarrely fascinated with the way that cults work and the way they're often driven by like personality. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and the willingness of people, quite intelligent people, to fall in line. Um,
Hmm.
I did read somewhere, and I can't remember who it was, but somebody said that it was actually easier to convince an intelligent person to join a cult environment than it was a like less intelligent or less educated person. Um,
It's interesting. I suppose I suppose if you're an enigmatic leader that makes a good case for what you're talking about and it follows some sort of logic.
That's it. I mean, I don't want to say more intelligent, but certainly when you're more educated in a certain way that your brain works, that you want things to make sense. You want
Yeah.
everything to make sense and for everything to fit together and have a reason for existing and all this kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And that's what it offers. And if they can convince you of that, then you immediately will buy into it in quite a big way because it seems to make sense of everything else around you. I think if your brain doesn't work like that, you might go along with it for a while, but then you'd be like, well, what the hell am I doing this? And off you go again.
Hmm.
Whereas I think the people who do like everything to be ordered and structured and to have an actual reason to it, I think once they're in, they then are very solidly in.
I've noticed that with the way that some people react to a death.
Mhm.
Because I've known a lot of people, and this is something that comes up at funerals a lot. I avoid them if I can because I'm awful in a funeral because my impulse is to try to cheer people up, and I'm not very good at being sad in front of other
Yeah,
people
I never know what
either.
to say. I get completely tongue-tied because I'm just worried I'm going to offend people. So I just like,
I have been known to make inappropriate dark jokes at funerals that don't land, obviously, because other people are in a different headspace. So I yeah, it's for the sake of the other people if I don't go to a funeral and I kind of have a little quiet grieve at home instead, just so that I'm not cracking a weird joke to someone's
yeah,
sibling or
that's what
something.
I worry is I would open my mouth and that is what would come out. So I'm just like,
No, it
I'll
just
just say nothing.
oh, yeah, yeah, I can't help it. It's just, but I have heard people say, so people that don't believe in God generally, they were never raised in any kind of religion, and then somebody passes away, and they're like, oh, but there has to be something after, though. There has to be because death is quite hard to process, I suppose, and it doesn't, especially if it's something that doesn't feel like it makes sense or that it's unfair, the way that it happens. So, and then people start trying to rationalize it. And I'm not saying that religion's wrong. I don't know. I don't have all of the knowledge in
No.
the universe about these things, but it's just people reaching into areas that they're not normally even thinking about to try and find an answer somewhere. So I can see how people could get roped into nefarious things that are offering answers and explanations and comfort.
But I still to this day find it really interesting that, like one of the things that I like about like writing within the weird and the uncanny and reading or watching
Mhm.
within the weird and the uncanny is it is that thing that it does where it kind of like pulls the rug out from beneath your feet. So, usually the main character in some way feels that the world is one way. And then by
Mhm.
the time you reach the end of the story, they've realized it isn't that way at all, and they've completely misunderstood. And actually, things are much weirder and stranger and less understandable than they
Mhm.
were. Um, and I feel like that is also the religion experience, surely. I mean, I haven't experienced it myself as much, but from what I gather, a lot of the appeal of religion and a lot of the just the experience of religion is that acceptance that we
Mhm.
don't know everything and that there are lots of things going on that we don't understand, but that there is some kind of guiding order to things that
Hmm.
we can't see, but it's there nonetheless. And the two just seem really similar to me. I just like it's like um, it's almost why I feel like when I hit peaks in a story, so like a big kind of euphoric peak or excitement peak or whatever, that it is almost like a semi-religious experience. But I
Hmm.
just but because I'm not religious myself, I kind of struggle with making it a religious experience. So it becomes about cults and
Well,
weird monsters and
maybe that's why your handling of the subgenre is so interesting because like if you didn't even realize that you were writing about religion to an extent in a lot of your stories, but because your worldview is so different, or just your experiences are so
yeah,
different, um, you bring in something else. Um, there's this is I suppose this is common in folk horror, but something I also noticed that I feel is kind of a thread in your stories is there's this aspect of having to perform a service and duty um to something bigger or to something
yes.
that is discovered and you're like, oh, okay, so that I didn't know that existed, but now this has changed how I have to behave. And I'm wondering if you think that that's reflective of us as a society at the moment, because people are kind of working themselves to the bone, not necessarily doing anything they want.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, it might be just being a father of two young children. I I am in
There it
thrall to
is.
the tiny gods that live in our house.
They do hold a lot more power than people think they do.
And yeah, don't ask me about the sacrifices. Um, but I mean, I think it's partly that. I do think as well. So there was a one of the best bits of writing advice I ever got was from, or I ever have had, because I might get more in the future. Um, it was from Paul Tremblay when he was at FantasyCon in Glasgow, and it was that quite often when he was writing stories, um, what he would do is what he originally thought of as the end point. Try and think of it as a middle point instead. So you think of where like your story's going, and especially if you're doing like a more traditional kind of Roald Dahl type twist in the tail type story. I said like, okay, well you've got your end point there, where there's the ton twist, and this is the big reveal. What
Mhm.
if that's not the end? What if that's the middle and the tipping point? Uh,
Yeah.
then what comes after? What's life like after that weird big reveal? And I think a lot of my stories in this book, probably more so than my previous work, do that just
Hmm.
because he's right. It makes things much more interesting. So you can tell a twist in the tail story where, oh yeah, it turns out that actually this has all been caused by the monster living in the basement. And
Hmm.
a big reveal, monster living in the basement. And then it's like, okay, but then what's your life like after that? When you're
Hmm.
living with the monster in the basement, knowing there's the monster in the basement. And it's kind of like, I find that dynamic really, really interesting. Not all of them do it. Some of them
Hmm.
don't and still go a bit twisted at the end. Um, and that again is kind of intentional because I don't want people to expect a twist. So it's kind of like sometimes it twists, sometimes it doesn't.
I think
Um,
that is effective though, because your stories are like, oh, that feels like it would be the punchline. So it's really interesting about where you're going to go after that because it makes it very unpredictable.
I think it's really fascinating, and I think it takes you much more into, well, at least it takes me into much more kind of weird fiction space.
Hmm.
Um, because what you're dealing with is largely kind of some version of reality, and then a kind of a twist is like, oh, reality's not the way I thought it was. But then
Hmm.
you're living in that weird reality for the
Yeah.
second half of the story. And it almost makes it slightly more fantastical. It almost sometimes becomes a bit more like dark fantasy,
Hmm.
less so than horror, because the horror is all in the shock and the horror of the reveal. But quite often, I'm quite interested in well, what comes after as well.
I
Um,
Yeah, I do not want sequels to these films because that's always the ruiner of something really good, standalone films. But I found that with Midsummer and Hereditary,
yeah.
very effective, like Hereditary especially, really effective horror film, like horrible, nasty stuff. But the end, I was like, what? But wait, no. Now what though? And I even more so with Midsummer because I was just like. I just feel like I started getting obsessed about like the behind the scenes features and looking at everything in every frame on Midsummer, trying to figure out what happened
Do you know,
following the
so
events.
Midsummer's an interesting example. So the my new publisher Clash actually referenced Midsummer on the blurb on the back of the book,
Yeah.
um, and I know there are people have issues with Midsummer. I know Paul Tremblay has issues with Midsummer actually because I had that discussion with him in Glasgow as well. Um, but I really like it.
Mhm. Yeah.
And I think I think it's a very personal response, but it speaks to all those things we've been talking about, those
Hmm.
moments of kind of the ground being pulled out from beneath your feet and
Yeah.
kind of a like weird euphoria, which you can't quite understand and is actually quite scary and intense,
Hmm.
but may be religious or may just be, you know, you going absolutely batshit crazy. Um, and it kind of toys with all of that.
Yeah.
And it also plays with that thing of not ending in a satisfying way.
Yeah.
Which I kind of like most of the weird and the uncanny, if you try and wrap it up in a neat little bow at the end, it just fails and the whole thing falls apart.
Yeah.
You need to leave it kind of gnarly and unexplained because that's the whole point, is that it's weird and unexplained.
I think that's what makes it fun to talk about after and reread or rewatch or like because this is spoiler for the end of Midsummer, so skip ahead a minute if you don't want to be spoiled. But I had this theory about Midsummer that I got obsessed with that Danny because they're not at the end of the Midsummer celebration at the end of that film. I realized through obsess it became like a special interest or something for a few months. It's like piecing together, and I was like, where are all the other May Queens? There are no other May Queens there. And I was like, oh, I bet like she's in the family for like 2 more days probably, and she's probably a goner.
Well, I mean, this is the thing though, is that I think it's one of the things that people who don't like it don't
Yeah.
like about it, is the fact that it doesn't tie up neatly, and
Hmm.
that there are things that don't make sense or seem like they could be continuity errors, or they could just be like,
It's not the point of the
yeah, it's
story
just kind
though
of like,
to it's about Danny, so that's it. I thought it tied up for Danny's narrative, but then for the wider world of what was going on, I was like, "Ooh, I wonder what else is there's more stuff. I just know there is."
I feel like as well, it's like, you know, when you watch something like The Wicker Man, you're very much kind of outside everything and watching Edward Woodward being burned
Yeah.
alive in it, and you're like you're on the outside. With Midsummer, you're not. You're on the inside.
I
And I think that's why it's so disorientating because it's disorientating for her, and so it's also disorientating for us.
I felt like the purpose of that film was to indoctrinate the audience into the Haga because the number of people I saw being like, "Yeah, sacrifice the boyfriend," and I was like, "Okay, the boyfriend's a bit shit, but that's a bit disproportionate to his crimes, like because he's, you
I
know,
think as well. I think people struggle with the amount of humor in it sometimes as well.
yeah,
But again, I really like that combination of weird and humor. I mean, the title
mhm,
story of Come Sing for the Harrowing, I find quite funny, but it is quite
yeah,
horrific at the same time. And has probably some of the most kind of like visceral, like physical horror of anything
mhm.
I've written, where it's they're putting like the fish hooks into his arms to like hang things
Oh,
off of him and stuff.
bleh.
It's really, I mean, I don't generally write that sort of horror, so for me, that's
No,
quite horrific. But at the same time, it's in a story which I think at times is quite funny, at least to
yeah.
me.
Well, there's a lot of what I so I'm always like, and another thing I love about your stories, but it's true. Something else I really love about the way that you're writing folk, because I love folk horror. But there's other really uncomfortable, weird little subgenres out there, and I find that you fold elements into of other subgenres into it in a way that makes it folky. So there's one story. Oh, which one is it? It was one of my favorites. I don't want to look down too much at my notes, but it's about a family and they're on a little holiday and they go in a cave.
Oh yes, yeah,
Um,
that's an
and
interesting one actually. That's so what's it called Darkness Below.
yeah, I
Um,
loved that because I felt like th- they were they were elements that I didn't know which way you were going to go with it, but there is a particular Gaelic folklore that really freaks me out that I thought that you were doing in this story, and maybe you were. I don't want to spoil it for anybody, but like just elements of all sorts of other really uncomfortable things, and you do capture. what's really scary and the uncanny in a lot of your stories, where just that feeling of like you know that something is off with a person or a thing, but you could not put your finger on it, but it just feels a bit instinctively scary. Like,
It's interesting to me actually. So that's that story, Darkness Below. Quite a few people have picked that out as like either their favorite or one of their favorites. That was the story, probably more than any other story I've written, that I really struggled with. I
really?
literally had to wrestle it into its current form. I mean, sometimes stories just come out in a big
Hmm.
splurge and they kind of vaguely work. I'm an editor by trade, so I edit everything pretty heavily, but they're kind of close to being finished.
Hmm.
That didn't. I was wrestling that for ages. I wrote about not even a half of it. I thought I'd written a half of it, and then it probably got cut back to being about a quarter of it in the end.
Hmm.
And I had to send it off in a different direction. And I left it for ages, and then I tried it again, and I couldn't get the tone to work. And
Hmm. Oh, what did I put?
um, I
You
had to work
froze for a
really,
second there.
really
Sorry,
hard,
Dan.
and to the extent that now I almost can't look at it without seeing all of the kind of the themes. Yeah.
Sorry, you froze a little bit, but I got most of what you just said.
You also went out of time in there for a second as well. Yeah, I could hear you speaking and your face wasn't moving, so we went out of sync for a second.
Yeah, you're slightly out of sync for me, right? I think it'll go back in, I think. I hope.
Yeah, you're
Um,
you're ever so slightly out of sync.
oh, you're okay now. Okay, I think it's
Okay.
okay. Um, oh, that is interesting. Because the thing
But it
I
was really
love.
weird. I had to work it really hard, and I struggle with reading it now because I can just see all the bits I cut out and all the bits I need to stitch together and like all the workings and stuff. And I think I will hard that I can't see what other people see in it because I worked at it so intensively and over and over again. Um, but that was an interesting one. I mean, it was based on an actual family trip to Cheddar Gorge. Not that any of those things actually happened, but that's where a lot of the detail comes
Would
from.
hope not. I think,
Um,
well, for me, the thing I found, because that was one of the scariest stories to me, and it was so eerie. And I think it's because when you're writing a story where somebody becomes suspicious about someone that they love all of a sudden, you don't know if you're reading a story about someone who's perhaps a little unwell in the moment and they're being really paranoid, or if they are right to be suspicious, and then I don't even know which one of those things is worse. Um,
but I think as
and
well, I mean, I think at heart, and this was the one of the realizations that enabled me to like finish writing the story. I think at heart, it's about being a parent and watching your child become a teenager. I think it's essentially a story about that, and just not feeling like you don't know the person that you love anymore because they've changed so fundamentally from the person they were. And I think that's kind of what it's about. But there's that realization kind of helped me then gel it all together and cut a load of stuff which, isn't there anymore, so we won't talk about it. But yeah, a load of stuff that was in it previously and just kind of focused a bit more in on that.
Mhm.
That then became the story for me, and that is quite scary. And I think at least one of the people who really enjoyed it said that it was like that parental fear
Yeah,
is what came through.
yeah. God, no, I can't even imagine. I can't imagine worrying because I don't have children, but I do know a lot of parents and their kids, and something that's expressed to me a lot is like people worry that when their kids get a bit older, they'll change and not like them as much anymore. Like the kid won't like the parent as much, and then
It's a genuine fear. I mean,
yeah.
luckily my two boys are lovely, so I don't actually worry about it that much. But I think it is genuine fear for a lot of people, and even not just with parenting either. I mean, I think even just loved ones in general. It's like, what do you
Mhm.
do when you turn around and your loved one not only doesn't like you anymore, but to you doesn't seem to be the same person they used to be.
Well,
Um, it's
people
like for
have
whatever
that.
reason, it's kind of
Yeah, people have that in their romantic relationships a lot.
yeah.
Um, I yeah, a few. Well, I also know a few divorced people, and they say things like they just could never imagine feeling the way they do about their ex because for a big patch of time there, like felt like they really, really knew them, and then all of a sudden, when things start going wrong, or when it was at its worst, when they were splitting up, they were like completely different people. And I'm like, yeah, like it is uh, it's a really uncomfortable kind of thought when you feel
It
like you know
is,
someone really
yeah.
well, but
And that was the feedback I got on that story is the people who liked it, that was what they kind of really connected with, was that kind of fear of just not knowing the person anymore.
yeah, it feels very alien all of a sudden.
Um, yeah, so I think that's where it came from. But that wasn't like a big part of the original story. So it took me a while to get there. And then from there to kind of find the tone and make it work. And like I said, cutting things.
Oh, I'm really
Lots of cutting going on.
I'm glad you worked it out though, because it's a great story. So glad it's in there.
I think it's partly being an editor, both like an editor, a line editor doing
Mhm.
edits on books, but also being an anthology editor and having to select material.
Mhm.
Um, is I can be quite harsh with my own stuff. So I was kind of writing it and I was like, this is awful. I really don't like this about it. I don't like that about it. The tones are wrong. It's just drifting. It's not going anywhere. And so I was really down on it. So yeah, at least I managed to wrestle it into some kind of shape at the end.
Yeah, a popular one apparently as well.
Yeah.
Um, this is my final question for you.
Aha.
Do you, people never like answering this question, but I have to know, do you have a favorite story in this collection, either that you just think is the best story or when you enjoyed writing the most?
It's hard to say, to be honest. There's a lot in here that I really enjoyed doing. So I'm trying to think. So there's the story which is now called whatever it's called, Bring Them All Into the Light, which
Mhm.
was originally called The High Priestess because it was for Steve Shaw's Great British Horror Anthology,
Mhm.
and I was given the title. Um, and there's elements in that which I really am amongst my happiest with. Not the entire story, but like the last kind of third of it where it all goes completely batshit.
Mhm.
That I'm really happy with. Especially because I managed to get an Elvis reference in there. But I enjoyed. I really like the way that it walks that line we talked about between
Mhm.
being funny, but also being quite horrific, but also being quite kind of euphoric and almost kind of spiritual in an out of body kind of way at the same
Mhm.
time. It does like all those things in one place, I think, when it works. So that I really like. Um, that's probably my favorite of all of them, although I really like the one that it closes on as well.
Mhm.
Beyond the beach, the trees.
Yeah,
Um, Partly because again, it's just so weird.
it is
I
weird. I like that
I
one.
kind of like the really I kind of really liked ending on a really kind of odd, weird, slightly
Mhm.
subliminal note. But partly as well because I was going for a very particular kind of tone for it.
Mhm.
Um, and I made the decision when writing it because of that to listen to the White Lotus Series 1 soundtrack on a loop whilst writing. Um, and then when I eventually sent it, it was actually to Brian Evanson for something, and he couldn't take it in the end. But he ended up writing the introduction to it all worked out lovely. But uh, his feedback when he came back was that he really liked it and really loved it, and unfortunately couldn't use it. And it really reminded him of White Lotus. And I was like, that is so bizarre because I've been listening to the music. That's what I've been doing. I haven't. It wasn't in any other way referencing White Lotus other than that it's set on a resort. That's it.
Mhm.
There's no other like White Lotus reference in it at all. But I was just listening to that music all the way through, and clearly somehow that tone of the
Mhm.
White Lotus music kind of seeped down through into the writing, which I
Yeah, you
find really
channeled it.
fascinating.
Um,
Um,
that's really cool. That's so funny though. Yeah, you
I
must have
kind of
like
feel like people should
channeled.
be listening to that when they read it, to be honest. If you can, stick on, especially like the theme tune for season one of White Lotus, and just listen to that while you're reading the story. That's the headspace I was in.
That's a good, yeah, that is a good reading tip for. I'm gonna have to reread it with that now. And where can people find this book and you, Dan?
Well, so the book hopefully should be widely available both in the US and the UK. So it's out with Clash Books on the 21st of April. They are an American publisher. However, they have now got UK distribution, so
Mhm.
it will be. available to order, if not in stock, from standard bookshops. It'll be available from Amazon. We are doing a couple of events. I'm doing an event in May at Waterstones in Islington in London
Mhm.
with Will McLean and Lucy McKnight Hardy, which is going to be fantastic. Um, I will be at the Chimera Festival as well in June,
Mhm.
which is going to be fantastic. I will be at British Fantasy Con in
Yay.
Glasgow in whenever that is, October.
Yeah.
Um, as well. I do far too many of those sorts of conventions and stuff.
Nah, there's no
Um,
such thing as too many.
well, I love doing them. I've actually just started. I've been writing a story that's partly set at a convention because I figured now was about time that I confessed that I've been for far too many of those. Um, I have 6 books coming out this year as well, including that one.
Oh my God.
So you won't be able to avoid me later this year, frankly.
Oh, we don't
September,
want to.
October time is the peak.
Well, I will put links for everything in the description so people can find the book and find you online and these events and everything. And thank you so much for coming back to talk about this. This was so much fun for me. It was really fun for me to get to read because it does feel like a new book. Um,
I think you're
and
right as well. I think because I mean, just going back a bit, like what you were saying about how I remember you being surprised where some of the stories went when you read them first
Mhm.
time round. But I think it probably is a different experience, isn't it, reading them now when you know when they're where they're going? Because
Yeah,
I always knew where they were going, so to me it's
yeah,
less of a surprise. Um, but I think it does change the reading experience. So, hopefully that was
yeah.
interesting. Thank you so much for supporting it as well.
Oh, it's my pleasure.
First time round and second time round. Hopefully not a third time round.
Yeah, we'll keep our fingers crossed. But yes,
Hopefully this sticks this time.
so yes, 21st of April, everybody. I'll put the links in the description so you can go check it out. And yes, wishing you the best of luck with this book launch, Dan.
Thank you very much.
Um, so all right, well, I guess we will say goodbye to the tribe there, and I'll have to get you back on your next book. Bye, everybody, and bleed.